Welcome to study session 5, Prelude to Revolution, the French and Indian War and the straining of British-American relations. The English and French fought frequently in King William's War 1689 to 1697, known in Europe as the War of the League of Augsburg. In Queen Anne's War 1702 to 1713, the War of the Spanish Succession. In King George's War 1755 to 1758, War of the Austrian Succession. And in French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, which began in America in 1755 and ended in Europe in 1763. In all of these wars, the French had the assistance of most Native Americans of the interior. During the course of these wars, the English gained strength in relation to their French and Spanish rivals, and in the French and India War, with strong help from colonial militaries, they expelled the French from mainland North America. In 1763, Britain became the lone European imperial power in North America between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River. The Spanish, allies of the French, gave up Florida but took over French claims in New Orleans and inland west of the Mississippi as compensation. Within 20 years, the British would lose most of what they had gained. Victory in the French and Indian War gave the British an enlarged mainland empire, but also brought new problems. First, the war had been expensive. The interest alone on England's debt required half the government revenues, and the overtaxed British people could not be asked to pay more. Second, the acquisition of French and Spanish territory gave the British new administrative tasks. They acquired not only vast tracts of land, but also the French settlers and indigenous peoples who lived there. The French and Indian War and the straining of British-American relations. The difficulties became clear in early 1763 when an Ottawa chief named Pontiac became worried about losing the French allies who had helped keep British settlers out of the interior. Pontiac led an uprising of a broad Native American coalition that included Seneca, Yandots, Delawares, Shawnee, Miami, Ottawa, and other nations. They attacked British fort and frontier settlements in Pennsylvania and Virginia. During the summer of 1763, they killed as many as 2,000 settlers, but they could not dislodge the British from their fortified strongholds at Detroit, Niagara, and other places in the interior. Settlers responded by murdering Native Americans, most of whom had done nothing. The British government realized that it needed not only more revenue but also a military presence and a colonial administrative policy to establish British authority and keep the peace in North America. Break with Britain. British officials believed that the British government and parliament in particular had the constitutional power to tax and govern the American colonies. The ruler of parliament assumed what they called parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament, they insisted, was dominant within the British constitution. Parliament was a break against arbitrary monarchs. Parliament alone could tax or write legislation, and Parliament could not consent to divide that authority with any other body. As Thomas Hudson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, put it, there could be no compromise between the supreme authority of Parliament and the total independence of the colonies. It is impossible. It is impossible there. It is impossible. There should be two independent legislatures in one and the same state. Constitutional misunderstandings. The Americans, however, had developed a very different opinion of how they should be governed. By the 1720s, all but two colonies had an elected assembly and an appointed governor. Contests between the two were common, with governor generally exercising greater power in the northern colonies and assemblies, wielding more power in the south. Governors technically had great power. Most were appointed by the king and stood for him in colonial government. Governors also had the power to make appointments and thus to pack the government with their followers. The assemblies, however, had the power of the purse. Only they could pass revenue, that is tax bills. Assemblies often used that power to gain control over appointments and sometimes to coerce all governors himself. This was particularly true during the French and Indian War, when the governors often asked assemblies to approve revenue bills and requisitions to fund the fighting. Assembly used their influence over finances to gain power in relation to governors. Colonies tended to view their elected assemblies as defenders against the king, against parliaments, and against colonial governors who were appointing to increase their power at the expense of popular liberty. Thus, when the British Parliament asserted its right to tax and govern the colonies, something it had never done before, ideas clashed. The British elite's idea of the power that its parliament had gained since 1689 collided with the American elites. Idea of the sovereignty of its own parliament. The British assumed that their parliament legislated for the whole empire. The American assumed that while the part of the empire shared British liberties and the British king, the colonies could be taxed and governed only by their own elected representatives. The British attempt to tax the colonies was certain to start a fight toward independence. Parliament passed the Sugar and Currency Act in 1763. The Sugar Act strengthened the customs service, and on the surface of it looked like the old Navigation Act. The Sugar Act was different, however, because it was designed not so much to regulate trade, that is a power that colonists had not questioned, but rather to raise revenue, a power that colonists denied to Parliament. The Currency Act forbade colonies to issue paper money, a move that many colonies saw as an unconstitutional intervention in their internal affairs. Individual colonies petitioned against these measures, but a unified colonial response to British colonial reform did not come until 1765. The Stamp Act crisis. That year, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which required all legal documents, license, commercial contracts, newspapers, pamphlets, dice and playing cards to carry a tax stamp. The stamp tax raised revenue from thousands of daily transactions in all of the colonies. In addition, those accused of violating the act would be tried in Vice Admiralty Court's Royal Tribunal without juries that formerly had only cases involved maritime law. The colonial assemblies petitioned the British, insisting that only they could tax Americans. The assemblies also sent delegates to a Stamp Act Congress, which adopted a moderate petition to protect and sent it to England. Other Americans took more forceful measures. Before the act went into effect, in every large colonial town, mobs of artisans and laborers, sometimes including blacks and women, attacked men who accepted appointment as Stamp Act commissioners, usually forcing them to resign. American merchants also organized non-importation agreements, which put pressure on English merchants, who in turn pressured the British government. In spring 1766, a newly elected parliament repealed the stamp tax, believing it had been unwise. Parliament did not, however, doubt its right to tax the colonies. When it repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which reaffirmed Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Townshend Act. In 1767, a new ministry led by Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend addressed the North American situation. Townshend drew up new taxes on imports, tea, lead, paper, glass, paint that Americans could receive only from Britain. More ominously, he earmarked the revenue from these duties for the salaries of colonial governors and judges, thus making them independent of the colonial assemblies. He also strengthened the organization responsible for enforcing customs duties and located its headquarters in Boston, the center of opposition to the Stamp Act. Finally, he moved many units of the British Army away from the frontier and nearer the centers of white population. Clearly, the Townshend Act were meant not only to tax the colonies but also to exact British authority. When colonial assemblies protested the duties, Townshend dissolved the assemblies, Americans rioted. They also agreed to boycott all imported British goods, particularly tea. The British responded by landing troops at Boston, the center of resistance, in October 1768. Tensions between townspeople and soldiers were constant for the next year and a half. On March 5, 1770, tension exploded into the Boston Massacre when British soldiers fired into a mob of Americans, killing 5 men. In England, on the day of Boston Massacre, Parliament repealed all of the Townshend duties except the one on tea, a powerful reminder that it could never relinquish its right to tax and govern Americans. The Americans in turn resumed imports of other goods, but continued to boycott tea. Other British measures. The Tea Act of 1773 maintained the tax on tea and gave the English East India Company a monopoly on the export of that commodity. The company's tea ships ran into trouble in American ports, most notably in Boston, where on December 16, 1773, colonials dressed as Native Americans dumped a shipload of tea into the harbor. Britain responded to this Boston Tea Party with the Intolerable Act of 1775, which closed the port of Boston until Bostonians paid for the tea. The act also permitted the British Army to conquer its troops in civilian households, allowed British soldiers accused of crime while on duty in America to be tried in Britain or in another colony, and reversed the Massachusetts Charter to abolish its elected legislature. At the same time, the Quebec Acts organized in British government in Canada that frightened many Protestant libertarian Americans. It allowed the Catholic Church to remain established in French Canada, and it established a government with fewer liberty than Americans enjoyed. Some Americans saw the act as a model for what the British had in mind for them. Along with the Intolerable Act and the Quebec Act came clear signs that Britain would use whatever military force it needed to subdue the American. Continental Congress. In September 1775, every colony but Georgia sent delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Congress refused to recognize the authority of Parliament and instead sent a petition to the king. The petition stated the principle that Parliament could not legislate for the colonies without their consent, and extended this principle beyond taxation to any legislation. Why the British Army occupied Boston? Massachusetts established a provincial congress that met in Concord. The new congress became the de facto government of Massachusetts. The British responded by sending an army out for Boston to seize armies and American leaders at Concord. They were met by brisket militiamen and colonial protests turned into revolutionary war at the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775. A second Continental Congress met the following month and proclaimed the militia that had routed the British in the countryside a Continental Army, with George Washington as its leader. In August, King George III proclaimed the colonies to be in rebellion. The British Army, after a costly victory at the Battle of Bunker Hill, left Boston and sailed for Nova Scotia. With that, there was virtually no British military presence in the rebellious 13 colonies. This is the end of study session 5. Thank you for listening.